This is the story of a grounded aircraft and invalidated flight manifest, and the exact moment Queen Camilla realized her crown does not grant her the keys to the sovereign transport fleet. In less than 24 hours, the carefully constructed illusion of her absolute command over the monarchy's billion-dollar logistical machinery was quietly and ruthlessly dismantled on a heavily guarded tarmac. What Queen Camilla just realized behind closed doors is that a title allows you to wave from the balcony and wear the historic jewels, but true institutional hard power is forged in strict financial oversight, sovereign asset control, and the silent enforcement of the true heirs. Over the next few minutes, we are going to unpack the highly audacious secret logistical coup she recently attempted under the guise of a charitable scouting mission. We will expose how a clandestine maneuver to hijack the sovereign flight and the royal train for her non-royal family inadvertently triggered a freezing institutional retaliation engineered by Prince William. By the end of this breakdown, you will understand the devastating realization currently paralyzing the Queen that despite sitting on the highest throne in the land, she commands absolutely no true authority over the dynasty's physical assets. To fully grasp the magnitude of this internal logistical warfare, we must first step back and analyze the monumental 30-year manipulation that brought Camilla to this modern peak of social supremacy. For 3 decades, she executed the longest, most forensic game of reputational rehabilitation in British history. She survived the bitter public ruin of the 1990s, systematically softened the global memory of Princess Diana's tragedy, impatiently replaced legacy palace officials with her own dedicated loyalists. When she was officially crowned queen, discarding the restrictive consort caveat entirely, she believed she had achieved an absolute unshakable mandate. She operated under the fundamental belief that her psychological control over King Charles was synonymous with control over the sprawling machinery of the crown. She felt entirely untouchable, assuming that the palace bureaucracy would always bend to her personal agenda, including the unrestricted use of the state's most exclusive privileges. But the fatal flaw in Camilla's complex architecture of power is that it is built entirely on a borrowed timeline, completely isolated from the enduring financial and administrative control held by the future king. That dangerous illusion of absolute authority collided with a brutal reality just days ago, driven by an overwhelming sense of commercial desperation and a desire to elevate her non-royal lineage. As the realities of King Charles's ongoing health battles become impossible to ignore, a deep-seated paranoia has taken root within the Queen's inner circle. Fearing that her ability to distribute royal perks will instantly evaporate the moment the crown shifts to the next generation, her senior advisors attempted an unprecedented, highly expensive administrative maneuver behind the scenes during a quiet period in the royal calendar. Camilla's logistical team quietly drafted a sweeping transportation mandate. What appears to be true, according to internal palace leaks, is that this document was a calculated attempt to hijack the sovereign flight and the historic royal train for a sprawling private Scottish vacation for the extended Parker Bowles family and her closest aristocratic allies. To bypass the grueling financial scrutiny of the sovereign grant, the taxpayer-funded pool that covers official royal travel, Camilla's office attempted to launder this private family holiday through a sophisticated bureaucratic disguise. They classified the sprawling logistical request as a high-tier charitable scouting mission and patronage review tour across the Scottish Highlands. By doing so, she was attempting to quietly siphon hundreds of thousands of pounds in sovereign operational costs to fund luxury travel for individuals who carry absolutely no royal blood. She was weaponizing the bureaucratic system, assuming she could slip this massive requisition into the routine flight logs, firmly believing that during a time of heightened family sensitivity, the travel office would simply comply in silence out of deference to her title. She severely underestimated the cold forensic vigilance of Prince William's administrative apparatus and the uncompromising nature of sovereign financial audits. The Prince of Wales does not rely on drawing room gossip to protect his inheritance. His team relies on the meticulous monitoring of royal logistics asset deployments and internal estate expenditures. The discovery of this secret transport coup did not manifest through an explosive family confrontation, but through a routine digital audit of the Sovereign Grant Requisition Service. When William's fiercely loyal Chief of Staff and financial oversight teams cross-referenced the newly submitted flight and rail manifests emanating from Camilla's office, the anomaly was immediately flagged. the passenger list was entirely devoid of working royals, replaced instead by Tom, Parker Bowles, Laura Lopes, and a curated list of private associates. When the paperwork was brought directly to Prince William, the reality was immediate and chilling. He recognized this not as a harmless desire for a family getaway, but as a parasitic encroachment upon the sovereign brand and a staggering exploitation of state assets. While Catherine, the Princess of Wales, continues her uncomplaining sacrifice and steadfast protection of the institution's dignity and financial integrity, Camilla was utilizing the bureaucratic system to distribute the ultimate symbols of royal luxury to outsiders. For William, this crossed an invisible, unforgivable line to allow the king's wife to treat the royal train and the sovereign flight as a personal, taxpayer-funded taxi service for her non-royal relatives would be an act of gross institutional negligence, threatening the very survival of the monarchy's public goodwill. The response from the future king was executed with a freezing, ruthless legality that used the very weight of institutional corporate protocol as a weapon. Prince William did not leak the attempted logistical theft to the press, nor did he allow his office to engage in an undignified shouting match within the palace corridors. He utilized the system to execute a silent, devastating counterstrike. Operating with unprecedented administrative leverage as the heir apparent and a senior stakeholder in sovereign logistics, William quietly coordinated a strict binding administrative update with the master of the household and the Royal Travel Office. They activated a rigid, unyielding protocol dictating that absolutely no sovereign transport assets could be deployed for engagements lacking a direct constitutional mandate without the explicit physical co-signature of the Prince of Wales. Without a single word spoken in anger, William legally and cleanly severed Camilla's access to the state's transport machinery. The execution of this silent retaliation was breathtaking in its subtlety, resulting in an absolute visual and psychological humiliation for the Queen. On the morning the sprawling Parker Bowles entourage arrived at the highly secure VIP terminal of RAF Northolt, expecting to board the gleaming, heavily customized sovereign flight aircraft for their taxpayer-funded Scottish tour. They did not find a subservient flight crew ready to welcome them aboard with champagne. Instead, as Camilla, her children, and her closest associates approached the secure perimeter of the tarmac, trailing luxury luggage and an expanded personal staff, they hit an invisible, impenetrable wall of state protocol. The heavily armed security personnel and royal flight directors operating under direct, binding instructions from William's administrative office rather than the king's household, politely but firmly halted the Queen's motorcade at the runway gates. In front of the bewildered ground crew and her own thoroughly embarrassed family members, the security officers informed her logistical team that their flight clearance and asset requisition had been permanently revoked under the new sovereign transport protocol. They were denied entry to the aircraft, their digital boarding credentials and manifest approvals had been completely wiped from the Royal Aviation mainframe. Furthermore, the lead logistics director was handed a perfectly polite, heavily formalized notice of requisition denial from William's estate, clearly stating that the requested multi-million-pound assets were strictly reserved for official state business, and any future attempts to bypass the standard financial vetting channels would result in a permanent logistical blacklist. What looked like a routine security check was actually a total dismantling of Camilla's logistical empire. She had to stand on the cold tarmac, maintaining her pristine aristocratic facade, while secretly knowing her entire family was being literally turned away from the plane by the very institution she thought she ruled. The humiliation of being escorted away from her own purported aircraft exposed the devastating reality of her position. As the reality of the grounded aircraft and the cancelled clearance set in, Camilla experienced a wave of cold, suffocating panic. That detail matters immensely because it marks the precise moment the grand illusion shattered. Stripped of her illusion of absolute control, financially walled off by her stepson, and publicly disciplined without a single word being spoken, she realized the trap had snapped shut. Her administrative trick had not only failed, but it had permanently exposed her total lack of foundational hard power. Terrified by the sudden collapse of her authority over the royal fleet, Camilla ordered her entourage to retreat. She went directly to King Charles, presenting the revoked flight logs and demanding that he use his supreme sovereign power to crush William's administrative blockade. She demanded that the king force the Prince of Wales to release the aircraft and aggressively enforce her absolute authority as queen over all state assets. The entire future of the internal royal hierarchy now hangs in the heavy, suffocating silence of the king's study as the queen stands waiting for her husband to deliver her salvation. When Queen Camilla stood in the quiet sanctuary of the king's study, demanding that Charles use the absolute power of the sovereign to crush William's administrative blockade and release the royal aircraft, she expected immediate explosive compliance. For 30 years, Charles had been her ultimate shield. He had fought his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth, his political advisors, the British press, and his own children to force Camilla's acceptance into the royal fold. He had spent decades burning through his own political capital to protect her from the consequences of their shared history. Camilla fully expected that in this moment of acute logistical humiliation, Charles would summon Prince William and deliver a crushing reprimand. She expected the king to remind his heir that Camilla was the queen, and that her family must be granted unrestricted access to the state's transportation assets to preserve the visual unity of her reign. But she encountered something far more terrifying than anger. She encountered a devastating silence. What appears to be true, according to those familiar with the internal dynamics of the king's household, is that Charles simply refused to intervene. He did not yell. He did not defend his wife's aggressive attempt to hijack the sovereign flight for a private family vacation. He looked at the revoked flight logs. He read the legally binding notice of requisition denial issued by his son's administrative office. He sat in the suffocating quiet of his study and he did absolutely nothing. This was the psychological climax of Camilla's decades-long campaign for total institutional supremacy, and it ended not with a grand declaration but with a freezing realization. Charles is no longer the rebel Prince of Wales fighting for his mistreated lover. He is the king. And as the monarch facing his own profound vulnerabilities, health battles, and the fragile state of his reign, his primary overriding duty is the preservation of the crown's financial and public integrity. Charles knows with forensic clarity that the sovereign grant is strictly monitored by the government and the British public. To attempt to use his emotional weight to override a strict financial blockade, simply to appease his wife's vanity and provide a taxpayer-funded luxury jet for her non-royal children, would be an act of institutional suicide. To publicly or privately dismantle William's invocation of the transport protocol would signal a chaotic, degraded monarchy that allows the king's wife to cannibalize the sacred state apparatus for private family networking. In that singular moment of silence, Charles chose the unvarnished survival of the institution over the commercial ambition of his wife. Camilla learned the hardest lesson of her royal life. The king will no longer save her from the chief executive of the bloodline. To understand why this logistical lockout is so permanently catastrophic for Camilla, we must examine the staggering reality hiding behind her royal title. The public sees a queen waving from the steps of a chartered state plane, projecting the image of a supreme matriarch whose victory is absolute. They assume that because she wears the crown today, she owns the fleet. But behind closed doors, the forensic architecture of the firm tells a remarkably different story. Camilla owns absolutely no state transportation assets, and her family possesses no constitutional right to utilize them. Her secret maneuvering with the flight manifest was never just about wanting a free ride to Scotland. It was a frantic, calculated attempt to secure a permanent visual foothold in the global aristocracy before her ultimate protector is gone. She knows that without King Charles, she instantly becomes a dowager queen, completely dependent on the very stepson whose aviation authority she just tried to bypass. Prince William is not just the heir to the throne, he is the ultimate guardian of the Duchy of Cornwall and a central director of joint sovereign logistics. He commands the vast administrative power that dictates how the family's private and public millions are spent. Camilla possesses no independent constitutional funding to charter a private sovereign fleet. By activating the transportation protocol, William legally, quietly, and permanently locked her family out of the dynasty's hangars, reminding her that her power is entirely theoretical while his is deeply legally structural. The realization that her entire social empire is now effectively grounded by her stepson's administrative goodwill is a psychological prison of her own making. The illusion of absolute logistical control was instantly replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of her dependency. As Camilla's shadow empire was quietly dismantled on the tarmac of the military base, the visual landscape of the monarchy began to immediately reflect the new order. This is where the silent execution of revenge translates into undeniable public reality. In the days following this internal crisis, viewers and royal analysts noticed a profound, subtle shift in how sovereign assets are being utilized. The Princess of Wales emerged as a portrait of freezing, aristocratic restraint without ever having to issue a single public statement defending the taxpayers' money. Catherine did not need to negotiate for respect-demand access to helicopters or complain about who gets to use the royal train. She simply allowed the massive quiet weight of her husband's absolute authority to protect the institution. Shortly after Camilla's family was turned away at the gates, Prince William and Catherine utilised the historic royal train for a highly publicised, officially mandated diplomatic tour across the country. To the untrained eye, it was standard royal duty. But to those watching the internal power dynamics, the visual cues were devastating. When Catherine stepped off the royal train immaculate and entirely composed, she was projecting an aura of absolute unshakable permanence. This was not a petty public relations choice. In the highest echelons of the British royal family, the utilisation of state assets is the forensic evidence of shifting power. By effortlessly commanding the nation's most historic transport, authorised seamlessly through their own secure channels, William and Catherine were actively executing the institutional restoration of the true bloodline while signalling the permanent boundary placed upon Camilla. They demonstrated that uncomplaining sacrifice, fierce protection of the nation's dignity, and steadfast loyalty to the crown will always outmaneuver the unchecked commercial ambition of outsiders. Catherine does not need to fight Camilla for dominance because her husband has already engineered the ultimate checkmate. The true royals remain on the inside, protecting the financial integrity of the state, and the opportunistic liabilities are managed with grounded flights and revoked travel clearances. This brings us to the deeper, tragic meaning of this entire crisis. Camilla spent 30 years carefully clawing her way to the very top of the British social hierarchy. She endured intense public hatred. She orchestrated a masterful public relations rehabilitation, and she successfully convinced Charles to place the highest crown in the land upon her head. She believed that reaching the summit meant she would finally be safe, that she could secure her family's place in the global aristocracy and force the state to fund their lifestyle. But what this story of the sovereign transport lockout undeniably proves is that the crown on Camilla's head cannot override the financial audits of the state. She is surrounded by the trappings of unimaginable wealth, yet she is paralysed by the operational reality that she is merely a temporary passenger in William's empire. She played a 30-year game of chess, sacrificing everything for the ultimate title, only to realise too late that the Prince of Wales holds the keys to every vehicle on the board. Camilla is now trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, sitting next to a king who will no longer defend her logistical overreach, walled off from the true assets of the monarchy, and forced to live under the absolute unyielding protocols of the next generation. The era of the Shadow Queen, attempting to restructure the physical machinery of the state, is effectively over. If you want to continue unpacking the silent warfare, the hidden administrative maneuvers, and the psychological power dynamics of the modern British monarchy, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We will continue to pull back the curtain on the illusions of power, one subtle detail at a time. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next analysis.